Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. Just as a reminder for all of our episodes, while we love interviewing people who fall far from the norm and interrogating radical ideas, we do not necessarily endorse the views of our guests on this show.
In this episode, we interview Dr. Timnit Gebru, a research scientist at Google on the ethical AI team and co-founder of Black in AI. Timnit previously did her postdoc at Microsoft Research for the FATE, which stands for Fairness, Transparency, Accountability, and Ethics in AI group, where she studied algorithmic bias and the ethical implications underlying any data mining project. She received her Ph.D. from the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, studying computer vision under Dr. Fei-Fei Li. In this interview, we explore the topic of representation and diversity in the field of technology, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, especially as it relates to the personal experiences of Timnit Gebru. And we also explore Timnit's motivation as a researcher and also what led her to eventually co-found the Black in AI community.
I'm very excited and very humbled that we were able to have this conversation and that we're able to present this conversation to folks today, especially with what is going on in the world as we release this episode. And we recorded this episode a few weeks ago. And so that was before George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. It was before protests started springing up around the country to address and to protest systematic oppression and racism in our country. And right now, as we're releasing this episode, there is just so much pain and fear and anger and righteous anger out in the world about these just deep-seated systems of oppression and violence that have been committed against Black bodies and Black folks and people of color for hundreds of years. And so Jess and I released this episode with a lot of humility. And as two white folks, Jess and I didn't want to center our voices in framing the discussion of what is going on in the country right now. And so we actually reached back out to Timnit a few weeks after the interview as we got prepared to release this episode to see if Timnit would be willing to share some words from her perspective. So the following are words that Timnit wanted to share with all of you. And following those words, we will go straight into the interview with Timnit Gebru.
Hi, everybody. I got a message from the great people of this podcast asking if I wanted to preface this podcast with a message given the kind of times we're in right now, at least in the U.S. And actually, I want to, I am an immigrant to the U.S. And before coming to the U.S., I did face ethnic-based discrimination, of course. But I found that the racism in the U.S. is something just so deep and just really, really deep, and like anything else I've ever seen before. And probably, other countries like South Africa and Brazil who have similar racial dynamics probably might feel the same. And a lot of times when you talk about this kind of stuff, people outside of the U.S., like many times Europeans, for example, different European countries would kind of want to tell you, but isn't the U.S. so terrible? Like, we don't have that, or oh man, it's so bad. Things are better here. You don't know whether things are better there or not, because white supremacy is basically a global phenomenon. The only difference is really how it manifests itself in different places, and the amount of dialogue and discourse and conflict that exists because of it. If you have people who are completely powerless, then there will not be protests regarding white supremacy because they just don't have a way to speak up. If you have people who have not thought about the history and its connections and its roots to many different things, then obviously you won't have this discourse. So don't think that this is just an American thing. This is a global phenomenon. Anytime I see Eritreans trying to get away and sinking boats, and the way they're treated as refugees in Italy, for example, let's not forget Italy colonized Eritrea. I remember that white supremacy is a global phenomenon. And of course, anytime an unarmed person of color, I'd say a black person, is killed by police, we remember that police brutality is not also a U.S. specific thing. So even though these things are happening in the U.S. right now, and it might seem that talking about them might be U.S. centric, this is really a global phenomenon. I thought I had to say this because I just heard some people saying that, coming out and saying Black Lives Matter or something like that will make their organization or their institution that is supposed to be international seem like it's biased towards the U.S. or something like that. No, this is a global phenomenon. It's just that we're witnessing it in the U.S. right now. And of course, remember that we should respond to things that are happening in our context in a specific way. So we are responding to what's happening in the U.S. right now in this way. But it's not only a U.S. specific problem. I think, I don't know what else to say. It's just so exhausting. I think Reddit said, we're not going to solve racism this month. And that's true. This is just a long haul. This is a marathon. And it's not going to be solved today. It's not going to be solved tomorrow. I'm happy to see that. It just seems that tech companies, for example, just can't. They've been forced to not ignore it right now. I'm happy to see the virtual walkout at Facebook. And people are talking about it at Google. And I know we should demand more. But I'm just thinking about like 2012, just saying Black Lives Matter was not acceptable. You were considered someone who is an agitator or conflict, someone who's looking for conflict just for saying the words Black Lives Matter or even having a t-shirt or something like that. And I don't know, maybe this is progress. Maybe it feels hard to say that. It doesn't feel like progress. It just feels like nothing has changed. In some ways, I feel like this is the same scene out of the late 60s where, I don't know, the same brutality is happening and the same, the media is reacting in the same exact way against protesters. People care more about property, it seems, than Black lives. But I don't know, maybe the fact that people can't hide from it might be progress. Who knows? It's really difficult to see anything as progress right now, but I'm just trying to think that maybe we are making progress. It I don't know, doesn't feel like it though. So yeah, I just wanted to send a message to everyone who is just must be feeling terrible right now, and to everybody else, this is who's not in the U.S. This is not just a U.S. thing. Many of these events happen, in the 60s. People fighting for independence were very much connected with people in the civil rights movement, right? And all of these movements, many times they're global. And so just because we're saying Black Lives Matter, I don't think that this is just like US specific thing. I don't know why I'm so focused on this, but this really struck a nerve for me. So I think that's all I have to say for now. And take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening. Okay, bye.
We are so excited to be on the line today with Dr. Timnit Gebru. Timnit, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing okay. Thank you so much for joining us. As we begin this interview, we wanted to start with almost the $1 million question, which is, what motivates you to do this work that you do? And we were wondering if you could paint a picture of your journey up to this point.
Sometimes motivation is hard to come by. So there are days that are like really hard to get motivated. And so anything that gets me motivated, when I am motivated, it's good feeling, actually. Even when I'm anxious or things like this, like being completely demotivated is one of the, feeling empty is one of the things that I don't like feeling that way. I had days where I felt like that many times. But so I think what motivates me is I think like sometimes when I see something that I think is clearly wrong, it's hard for me to step away from it. And like, I'm learning how to step away now many times, because you can't just try to address everything, right? But I think each email I get from someone who talks about like how my work has, touched something in their life, or my work has changed the way they're thinking about it or inspired them to do something, that's really motivating for me. So I think like ever since I was a little kid, I had a little bit of an activist streak. I wouldn't say, I'm totally 100% activist, because many times I feel like changing something is about actually the execution, just the day-to-day kind of boring Excel spreadsheet, just calling phones, whatever kind of execution, and there's many times where I've worked with a lot of people where there are a lot of grand ideas and things, but the execution is not there, and the execution is never glamorous. Like, it's really never anything to, show off. It's just kind of boring stuff you want to do. So, when I was a little kid, I remember my mom told me I was like 4 years old or something like that. And so, I grew up in Ethiopia, and older people are really, really respected. They just get the first dibs on everything, right? Like, food, or just they order you around. And as the youngest, as a little kid, you're always just gonna, you have to serve them. And so, and then there was a communist government, and they had a motto that was like, which means that's in Amharic, which means like the best for the kids. And so I protested. Like, I went to my mom and I was like, we always have these get-togethers, and like what happens is that the older people eat first, and all the yummy food, like when it gets to me, like some of the great food is gone. Like, I have to, eat the stuff that's not done, and so, and then there's this motto of like the best for kids. And I don't think this is true, because like we're not getting the best, we're getting the last, like, And she didn't really take me seriously. She thought it was funny, and I demanded to be taken seriously. And then I remember like in school, we raised some money to build a library or something. This was a long time ago, like middle school or something. And I don't remember exactly what happened. I don't know if maybe they didn't use the money for the library, or maybe they did something. And I think we decided to have a strike or something like that. And my mom was supportive, but she was like, don't let them single you out. Like, you don't want to be singled out as like the, so I always like, I kind of always had this streak a little bit. And one thing I think that really helped me growing up is that I grew up in a very supportive environment. So I saw my sisters. I was raised basically by a single mom, and my sisters were both electrical engineers, and I went to an all-girls school. It's interesting, I went to an all-girls Catholic school, and I feel like that school has created some of the most independent women. It's not necessarily something you associate with, with strict kind of disciplinary schools like that. But like when I look at a lot of my friends who are women who went to that school, they're very independent. So I grew up with that kind of really supportive environment. And I never felt like I can't do something because of any of those identities that I had. But I was also, I'm Eritrean ethnically. And, there was always this feeling of being Eritrean, like freedom fighters, people fought for independence for 30 years and like this little country. And so you always hear these stories, right? Like your family are involved in these kinds of things. And so you always grow up hearing these stories of freedom fighters and struggles. And I think that also kind of shapes, your attitude and who you are. And so at some point we had to leave the country. And so seeing the immigration process. So like we had to leave. I went to Ireland and then I came to the States. And we, later had political asylum. Then we applied for a green card, and that took a very long time because of 9/11, and then after coming to the States, I experienced so many things. I experienced all sorts of racism, all sorts of sexism. I think one thing I realized is that, one way to understand how far we are from equity here is that the story that's told, it's so, it's really not accurate at all, right? Like as an immigrant, when I was in high school, I basically learned like, oh yeah, there was this thing called slavery and then, blah, 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 like Native Americans, Trail of Tears. And then, it's fine now. That's it. There was this bad guy called Malcolm X, good guy called Martin Luther King. And that's all you learn, right? And after all the racism I experienced in high school, I was just like, this cannot be this can't be the only thing. This cannot be the end of it. So then I started reading up and I took a class at Stanford and in, like civil rights in the modern era and 20th century. And I was just I was shocked. Like we didn't learn about lynchings. We didn't learn about we didn't learn about anything in high school. And so how can you move forward when the country is completely in denial with what, its own history, right? Whereas on the other hand, I spent my entire high school learning about Nazi Germany and, we're in the US, but we analyze Nazi Germany and like who's responsible and all that stuff. So anyway, so all to say that all of these things I think kind of shaped my thinking and I was always, into math and physics. And so I was always kind of interested in engineering and the sciences. And I always thought of anything different, anything else that I do as separate from that. Like I never kind of connected the two. I actually liked it. I thought, oh, okay, great. Here's this technical thing I can do. Like this has nothing to do with, societal issues and whatever. I can just go do this thing. And then, when I don't want to worry about the societal issues, I'll just do this thing. And then here are all these other issues that are going on. And literally until very recently, when I'm reading like people like Ruha that, you interviewed, and when I'm reading the ways in which, engineers are many times can be part of the problem, the ways in which lots of companies were involved in, Nazi Germany or like apartheid, and things like that. I mean, that's pretty recent. Like when I started learning about it, the history of Silicon Valley, right? When I was at Stanford, I mean, I did not learn about, some of the histories of Silicon Valley or how the profit is tied to war or how its development is tied, those kinds of things. We just kind of learned about how I was very fascinated by like this place. I thought it was very innovative. I wanted to be a part of it. And so, I mean, even in the last 5-6 years, I would say like 2012 me and now my thinking is very different. So it makes me wonder like how my thinking will be different like 5 years from now or, 8 years from now. Anyways, that's a whole kind of rambling to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what kinds of things I think about and what motivates me.
And coming from your childhood as an activist kid over in Ethiopia, and then to being an engineer in the States at the university level, I'm wondering if you have a specific memory or a moment maybe where you started to realize that the technical and the social could be connected, and if there's anything in particular that comes to your mind and what pushed you towards that direction.
That's interesting, actually. So I was always, the way in which I connected them always was how there was no representation in the workforce. So there were no Black people, there were not many women, and so that was the way in which I connected it. What happened, and so I was actually very worried about being kind of bucketed into this, Black woman doing things about Black women stuff. And I always actually got very irritated when people had these studies like, oh, why don't we have more women in engineering? Well, women want to do things that help people and that kind of stuff. And I was just like, maybe women don't want to work with assholes. Like, and maybe that's just it. Maybe women just want to, maybe there are women who just want to do stuff that's not related to people just because it's fun, like some other people do. But maybe when they're in those fields, they just can't stand the environment, and then they leave, and maybe that's what it is. I don't know. So I always kind of got annoyed with these kinds of bucketings, and I wanted to make sure that I was known for like my just baseline computer vision, whatever things, not like my other stuff, and the other stuff is just completely separate, is sort of how I wanted it to be. And I remember like my advisor, I think it's like in 2015 or something like that, or 2016, I think, she was like, you have like, there's two things you care about. You care about social justice and you care about all this stuff. And then you also like you work on computer vision and things like this, and your thesis should combine both of them. Like, I think your thesis should combine both AI and like social justice, and that should be like your direction. And I was pretty resistant to it, actually. And I was just like, I didn't say no, but I was just like, but I don't want to be like the, one person, that was kind of what happened. But in the end, it just ended up that way, right? Like, it just ended up being that was the direction I was taking anyways. And now really, I don't really care what exactly I'm known for or anything like that, because you'll always feel like you'll have to have something to prove. And at some point, like, who are you trying to prove what to? So it doesn't matter, right? Like, you do this thing and you have to prove this other thing, you do this other thing, you have to, so, now I don't really care. Like, I'm writing whatever kinds of papers I want to write, which is nice, like, I'm collaborating with whoever I want to collaborate with. And I don't care if the paper has math or if it doesn't, so that's nice to be. I'm actually happy that I'm in that spot right now. But yeah, but that's kind of how it came to be.
In terms of because I saw your face kind of light up when you talked about what you're working on right now. I'm wondering what you're particularly excited about in terms of either your research right now or professionally what you're looking at right now.
So so just right now, I just came from a meeting with many people on my team. So you might know Alex Hanna, Emily Denton, William Isaac, who is at DeepMind, but he's the general chair. In fact, one of the general chairs next year. And Unso Jo, who I collaborated with on this paper. She's a historian. She's, I think, finishing up her Ph.D. at Stanford. So we were just talking about a project we're working on right now, and it was Unso's idea, and she wants to apply like historical, some methodology from history to analyze biases in data sets. And also, so historians learn about analyzing primary sources and things like that. And so that's one of the things right now we were discussing. And so that's fun, right? Like, to be able to do that. And I noticed, I was thinking about like this a lot. I noticed this there is a huge bias in our community, right? And I think it was Mar Hicks. I don't know if you guys follow Mar Hicks. I love them. They're like a historian of tech. I think it was Mark who was saying that each time, they were saying like why some of these coding boot camps and things like that, like if there's no systematic change, these things in their on their own that are trying to bring more people of color or more women or whatever won't really do anything. Because what happens is that the moment something becomes dominated by non-white men, it becomes not, that somehow like it gets downgraded. Right, so that's the history of computer science, right? Like it was supposed to be like people kind of described it as a secretarial thing or whatever, and like they were advertising it as if it was this, it was targeted towards women, and then it kind of changed, and now and like when it became lucrative, it became a kind of a man only thing, and so the problem is anytime something changes status, then it becomes like dominated by the majority. And so I was thinking like in my field, for example, there are many cases where you apply a concept from a different field, like for example, from physics or from a different field, and you apply the modeling techniques or some math that some kind of understanding, and you apply it to your setting. And that's always something that's welcome. That's always something that people kind of accept. Except the same kind of respect is not afforded to the disciplines that are not considered technical. And what does that even mean, right? Like, so if you bring ideas from critical race theory into machine learning, for example, that's not as respected by the machine learning community, right? Because they'll be like, oh, but then where is the technical component? Like, where is the whatever component? Like, why do you have to see math in there? Math is a tool just like everything else. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to advance a particular field. So why does it matter so much, how you're doing it? Because in my opinion, this is gatekeeping, just similar to how, like I said, something loses status or gains status depending on who in the majority is doing it. And so in my opinion, this is the way in which, people are shut out. This is kind of a gatekeeping mechanism. So for me, I don't really see the difference if I'm bringing ideas from, for example, from my prior background, analog circuit design, into machine learning. And the thing that I found most compelling was something as simple as data sheets. Like, why? That's not math, that's process, so that's really what I think is important. Or if it's history, or it can be like physics, it doesn't matter, right? Like, but you can bring in different components from different disciplines. And if it's really advancing the field, I don't really know why it matters whether it has some mathematical component to it versus not.
Do you think that fear of not being taken as seriously by the community in technology and in AI and machine learning especially played into part of that fear that you had in initially bringing in those like social justice ideas and wants for your research originally when you were back at Stanford?
100%. 100%. I did not want to be, again, like I did not want to be bucketed. Because, people want to bucket you into different buckets. That's one thing I noticed about the U.S. Actually, I remember I always said this immigrating to the U.S. When I was in school, I was never bucketed into either the popular person or the nerdy person or the sporty person or the music person, right? And here, like in high school, there is like these buckets. Like if you're the nerdy person, you can't be the sporty person. If you're the sporty person, you have to be the jock. If you're the band person, you can't be. I mean, it's so that's not how it is when I was growing up, right? Like there are the quiet people, there are the nerdy people. The nerdy people can be the popular people can be whatever. Like it wasn't like this, you have to fit in this one bucket thing. And so this is exactly why I have to read this book. I ordered Sorting Things Out, the effects of classification or something like that. This is, like Alex Hanna told me to read this book a long time ago, and I really want to read it. And so when I was, when you're in an environment where you're already the only one, you're already out of place. Your ideas of reality are already so different from other people's ideas of reality. You already have to make sure that everything you say is like really accurate, because someone's gonna like challenge you with such confidence, And so when you're in an environment like that, what you want to show to people is that you're as good as them at their own game, at whatever they're doing, right? But what I realized is, like, later on, it's really important for us to be educated about our history and how things came to be that way, right? It's only once I started reading Mar's works and Ruha's works and other people's works where I realized, like, well, why do I feel that way? Why am I made to feel that way? And why am I trying to shy away from the things that are truly important? I feel like there needs to be some sort of transformation in our industry, right? And so why am I being made to feel this way? That's when I stopped like caring about it. And I also feel it's important, I sort of feel like I've proven myself to a certain extent that like anything more is not necessary. So like to a certain extent, like you have to, I was reading Trevor Noah's book, right? Born a Crime. And he talks about how, language is a big tool, right? For that can be used in many ways. And so when you speak someone's language, they're more likely to listen to you anyways, right? And so if I want to go to the computer vision community or the machine learning community or whatever, and I want to introduce certain ideas, if I speak their language, it's much more, I'm much more likely, I feel, to introduce this language, to kind of introduce them into certain other ideas, even interdisciplinary ideas that I'm interested in. I would like the machine learning community to take seriously. But if I don't speak their language and they feel like I'm coming from the outside and I'm just, speaking a different language, or I don't understand this, or I don't understand that, I think it's much harder for people to take me seriously, right? So even strategically, like even without that fear that you're talking about, even strategically, I think it's important to establish yourself as part of some community so that people take you seriously to a certain extent, so that you tell them, hey, look, like I do speak your language, like, and so listen to me, right? If you don't, then it's much harder to kind of, I think, send a message, I guess, that you want to send.
Yeah, it's when you talk about like the high school experience, which was very similar to my high school experience, where everyone gets put in a bucket, it sounds very immature, right? And then you look at what's going on at academia and then also in industry, and it's like,
that's what happens.
Right? It's like, yeah. The why is the question that comes to mind for me. But also, while you've been doing this work, actually, could we take a step back about representation for a second? For folks that aren't aware of the issues of representation, either in the academy or out in industry, could you just give a kind of representation 101 about what the issue might be and why it matters?
Oh man, it is dire. It was shocking to me. So when I went to school at Stanford as an undergrad, and there's all of these efforts to bring people in. This is exactly so. What a lot of people do at work, at Google, at Stanford, whatever. Take whichever institution. I feel they try to focus on. People are like, oh, let's get them interested early. Let's bring them in. Let's hire. Let's like get whatever. The problem is once you're there are a lot of people interested. There are a lot of people doing something, but people are not taking this inclusion seriously of the DEI part, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So at Stanford too, what happens is a lot of people are brought in. So I think at the undergrad level, I felt, I saw a representation, not necessarily in electrical engineering though, not in my field. Even people who started in, they would drop off. And by the very end, you had like almost no black people. In grad school, zero, right? Like I saw nobody. And in these conferences, literally, like I always talk about this, I counted at some point like 5 out of 5,500, right? And this is an international conference. Globally, white people are a minority, right? You should see maybe like 10% white, like 20% black, like, you know what I mean? Maybe 60%, from the Asian continent, like This is the global representation of human beings, right? And I saw like 5 black people out of 5,500 at the same time. This was in 2016, right? And at the same time, there was all of this hype about AI, all of this But at the same time, that was the first time I read this ProPublica article talking about crime recidivism and how, algorithms were being used to predict to supposedly predict who is likely to commit a crime again, et cetera, et cetera. It's being used, this information is being used by judges to post bail amounts and in sentencing. And I did not know that. It was the first time I heard, I saw this article. At the same time, I was aware of Joy's work, and we had already started collaborating. And so that's kind of where I was starting to put two and two together. I'm like, oh my God, like there's no representation, but at the same time, this is what's happening, with algorithms that are being used in manners that are not benefiting many people in the world, right? And so that's sort of that was kind of how I felt, and I had experiences, for example, trying to talk to people around me about police violence, or like even just telling them my own stories, and they don't want to believe it. They don't. I remember people telling me like, "Oh, things must have been easy for me because I'm both Black and a woman." This is the kind of stuff people were telling me in grad school, and I'm just like, "Are you kidding me? Were you also, And so seeing that this was my experience, and this is the group of people who are going to be the heads of companies, the heads of the AI departments, the heads of this, the professors of the future or whatever, and designing all of these algorithms. And their reality is so different. I mean, people's reality in this country is so different anyways, because someone coming from a different country will not know anything about the history of oppression in the US, right? And even if you grow up here, you'll have a completely different reality. Like you don't learn about it. And so on top of that, there's no representation. And so this is the group of people designing that, technology of the future. So it's not just about, excuse me, I think representation is not just about seeing someone else who looks like you, right? It's not just about the look, right? It's also like the reality, the lived experience that you have. So many times when people bring in people from underrepresented groups, I feel like they want the look, they want a Black face or a Black female face, and then you just think the same way as everybody else and do the same thing as everybody else. You just happen to be like a Black female face. But that is not representation. That's not inclusion, right? If you're a Black female face that is advancing the same kind of oppressive system that exists right now, that's, in my opinion, that's not representation, right? And so I feel like each time I speak up, actually, people always have issues with kind of the way I say something or whatever. We call it #communication difficulties. There's always it's like, I'm like, I don't have communication difficulties. I'm just communicating difficult things that you don't want to hear, right? And so if you don't allow people from underrepresented groups to talk about marginalization, like what does that mean? That's not representation, in my opinion, right? So, I mean, I can go on forever regarding representation. But yeah, so this is why, so I co-founded Black in AI with my colleague Radhika Beba, and I mean, Black in AI, I think a lot of people have told me how it has helped them kind of feel less isolated. But it has also taken so much of my time, starting in 2016, 2015. So one person said, people don't understand how much time, not just physical time, just time to do all the groundwork that is necessary to do that most people wouldn't do. But like physical time, but like also mental energy, that it takes to do this kind of stuff and still keep up with the other things you have to do, because you can't let those things slip either. But anyways, yeah, that's my one-on-one on representation. This is something I can talk about for like a very, very long time.
Yeah, well, the community that you co-founded, Black in AI, would you call it a community or a group, or how would you label the?
I think it's a group. It's like maybe it's a community is a good way to put it. So we have the first thing we wanted to do was like, who is out there? You know what I mean? Like, let's just know who is out there. The second thing we wanted to do is provide kind of visibility for people. So there are a lot of people, a lot of great people out there, but they don't get invited to give keynotes, or they're not recruited, or whatever. Maybe they don't get funding for their startups. So like, how can we amplify their voices and get them? So we have a public facing Facebook and Twitter account that just kind of, just like posts, things that are happening by people in Black and AI, right? Like either papers they wrote or interviews they had, or like blog posts they wrote, or something like this. And then we also have a workshop. That's our biggest thing, is to bring people to these conferences, because so many things happen at these conferences. Many decisions are made at these conferences, right? Like people informally kind of network, and then they invite them to some other stuff. They collaborate together. They get funding for something, and if you're left out of these conversations, these informal conversations, it's very difficult to get any sort of resources or collaborators. And also there's also people who met there, and who went off on their own and started their own, kind of thing. So for example, what I find really funny is that a lot of the people I met from Ethiopia, they met at Black and AI, right? They are all living in Ethiopia. They met at Black and AI in like the US at some point at the Black and AI workshop. And then they went off and like together they organized like the first AI conference in Ethiopia. They organized like so the Deep Learning Indaba X. So Deep Learning Indaba is like another organization that I really like, and they have summer school. And, they rotate in like different African countries. Last year it was in Nairobi. Well, now it's I guess virtual. But so it's basically for people of African descent everywhere, right? Like, so people in the Black diaspora, like everywhere in the world, right? And so it's really great to see people kind of, and then people, the online community, people are like working together and collaborating and writing papers. So it's really cool to see people kind of meeting each other and collaborating together. And I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a space where people can thrive, right? Like, so give them more visibility, hopefully give them more resources for things that they're doing, provide support, and kind of network. I mean, things are not about meritocracy. Things are about networks, actually. And so when people have a network of people who support them and who amplify their voices, I think that's when they succeed. So that's one of the things we're trying to have here.
Yeah, and you've given us a lot of the motivation, it seems, for why this is important and what caused you to want to create this community, and then what the community is and how it's helping people. And I'm really curious what the experience has been like, and the response from the AI community at these conferences, but also just in general, and the response from the people who have joined the community. What has the experience been like for you as a co-founder?
I think a lot has happened that I didn't anticipate. And so, I know, for example, all of these other organizations started, right? Disabilities in AI, Latinx in AI. What else? I mean, I think there might be more, but like these organizations did not exist before, and now they exist. After Queer in AI, how can I forget Queer in AI? Yeah, and so Queer in AI, Disabilities in AI, Latinx in AI, all of them were not around before, and now they are, which is great, right? And a lot of times, what happens is that all of us can sort of talk about advocacy together, right? So for underrepresented groups, so if we can band together to then like advocate for things that are good for all of us, right? And so I think that's been good. So one example is, I remember, Deborah Raji, who's like a superstar now. You might know her, or you might have interviewed her. So for example, she wrote all sorts of great papers, but she wrote, her and Joy wrote a follow-up paper to Gender Shades that showed that Amazon's recognition that they still sell to law enforcement has a similar type of bias, right? Similar error disparities in error rates among, for example, darker skinned women and lighter skinned men. So the thing we showed in Gender Shades. And they tried to shut down they tried to shut them down. They were like, VP after VP was going after her and Joy. And Deb told me that by the time she came to the first Black and AI workshop, she was ready to leave the tech industry. And she was feeling isolated and was kind of ready to leave the tech industry, right? And so for me, that's really what it's all about, right? Research is not just about, so if you're interested in advancing a particular field, there are many ways that can happen, that can be done. One is you yourself doing something, but the better way is having a multiplier effect where a lot of other people are doing something who wouldn't otherwise do this thing. And it's really important for people like Deb to be involved in this research, because there are very few people who take the kinds of risks that people who care about their community take, right? Like, it's not just writing a paper for Deb. It was also kind of making sure that her community is not harmed. And so for me, it's really important to make sure that people like that still stay in the field and get the support that they need. I mean, when I look back and see many of the things we've done, I'm proud of the organization, but I always see the things we have to do. Like, it's always like, the thing for me and Black and AI is always like, I have this like to-do list right now of so much to-do list, like, send email to this person, finalize goals and stuff, create an application for this thing, like figure out what to do for this other thing. This is my list of to-dos for Black and AI. And I just, there's always a never ending, like this huge list of to-dos. And I always think about like all the stuff in which we can improve, right? And so I think there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do with our online community management. I think that's one thing we want to focus on this year. Just kind of because, of course, like by necessity as well, make sure that our online community is strong and kind of encourage people to find each other and have collaborations. But there have been many people like writing us about, how like they got a particular internship because of us, or they got a scholarship to go to some summer school, or they got this job, or they got this Ph.D., they got into a Ph.D. Program or postdoc or whatever. And that feels good, right? Like, that feels really good.
This reminds me of something that you said earlier that I want to follow up with when you were talking about the, we'll call it the denial of kind of the American milieu about slavery, about difficult conversations in general, about racism, the list goes on. And you said, how can we move forward when the country is in denial? And my experience has been that, especially in regards to representation, the tech industry is still, it's getting there, but it's still in denial in certain ways. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about, how, and maybe Black and AI is a way that you're beginning this conversation. But how do we move forward as an industry when we're still so stuck in denial?
I think that the combination of denial and talking about diversity can be dangerous sometimes, because if you understand the history of this country and you understand just how oppressed certain groups of people have been, then you talk about diversity, you can put it in a particular context. But if you don't understand the history of this country and what is going on, and then you just talk about diversity, then diversity just becomes about variety, right? It's like, oh, we need X number of this people, X number of that people, and then that's diversity. And then the whole conversation, in my opinion, just gets derailed, right? Like, so I mean, for me, when we were talking about Black and AI, for example, we were talking about, should we call it like something more broad, like underrepresented people in AI or whatever? And we decided finally, no, let's call it Black and AI, because there is enough to we want it to be focused. There are things that are happening that are specific to Black people in AI, right? And if we just called it like, let's say underrepresented people in AI or whatever, that specific thing would not be addressed. And I think I see a similar thing happening with diversity, right? Like, the conversation just becomes about all groups of people, all types of representation, right? But there are specific things that are happening with specific groups that you have to look at historically. That historical context is really important, right? And so, for example, when you talk about, reverse race, like, let's talk about, when we say racism, anti-Black racism is, I think, manifests itself in such a different way than, let's say, like some other kind of racism that because of the deep historical roots in this country, right? I'm not talking about the world, I'm talking about this country, right? And so I think like having that conversation about diversity without specific historical and understanding, I just feel like it just derails the whole conversation, right? Like, and then people are like, what about this thing? What about this other thing? I'm like, and so I can say the same thing about, like, let's say people with disabilities, for example, right? Like if we understand the historical context and the struggle, and I mean we can go on and on, like same thing with the LGBTQ plus movement, right? Like we have to look at his specific groups and the historical context of what diversity and equity means for that group of people. If we just start talking about diversity like it's some sort of like variety, why don't we have this group? Why do we only have one of this group? Why do we only have two of this? Then it just becomes a conversation that's not rooted in why we are talking about diversity in the first place, right? And so, and I feel like that's happening right now in the tech industry, right? Like instead of like in spite of how much talk there is about diversity, there's like, I can't tell. I mean, Rachel Thomas has this great writing about how branding hurts diversity. And I think that's, it's a great reading material in my opinion. Like, so, and my experience has been like that, right? Like diversity branding is hurting diversity because, now everybody's aware that there's something called diversity that we all have to be thinking about, right? Like I think very few people in the tech industry have not heard the word diversity, but then now there's like either a backlash or a different understanding of what diversity is because we don't have this education of what exactly is people are enduring in the US, right? And so somehow I just don't know. I don't know what to do, but like I think we need to have this understanding of what the reality is for different groups of people, like, and people need to be educated. And the second thing I think that is difficult that I've seen, people don't want to have confrontations. They don't want to feel uncomfortable. They don't, and like, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been told I should communicate differently, or I shouldn't, be so public about what I'm saying, or I should try this avenue first. I should try, whatever. You can't tell me that and then say you care about diversity and expect to have any sort of change, right? Sita Pena, I don't know if you know her. She's a social scientist, and she's based out of London right now. But like, we were in a workshop together, and one thing she collaborates with other people on this project called Our Data Bodies. I really like this project. I think you should check it out. And she talks about how there's a lot of anger, and that anger needs to be expressed in order to have a shared language and a shared understanding and a shared reality. But what happens right now is that anger cannot be expressed at all. It's like someone is, let's say someone is shooting you and you scream because someone is shooting you, and people are criticizing the way in which you're screaming. But they're not really criticizing the fact that someone is shooting you. You're like, how are you, someone is like literally shooting me, and you are criticizing the way in which I'm reacting to it, right? Like that's what's happening right now. So if we don't address the equity, the inclusion part, how do people feel once they're in these spaces? I just can't imagine. I don't know how we can figure out the other parts.
Yeah, thank you for being so authentic with your experience, by the way. I think this is really important always for people, our listeners especially, to hear what these experiences are like, especially those who are probably experiencing similar things, whether it's in industry or academia. And Dylan and I are PhD students, so we're pretty deeply situated in academia right now. And I know a lot of academics, they talk about representation in the tech industry, and we use this term, the tech industry, a lot, but you're uniquely situated in the tech industry right now, and you're working in industry, and you have a background in academia. So I'm wondering if you see these issues of diversity and representation any differently in industry than you do in academia, and what people's and companies and organizations' approaches are for representation in the tech industry.
I can be a little positive for a second, before I get back to my usual kind of complaint. But the improvement, at least I've seen for me, is in my little small island, right? Like in our team, I think we're like collecting people who were at the verge of leaving the tech industry or something like that. That's sort of what we're doing in our team. And that's because my manager has sort of he's provided me cover. Like so many times people would tell him to like tell me to shut up or something or whatever, like so many, just this or that. But for me to get to a place like that with him, it took us, again, a lot. It was very emotionally difficult. He did not understand, or he would get defensive, and I would I would talk to him, and some of my allies, like this guy Sergio at Google, he's great. He set up like monthly meetings with my manager to like talk to him, to educate him. I mean, that's a great ally. That's the kind of stuff you should do. Yeah, and like it was just, I almost quit so many times. I mean, the number of times I said I quit was like, I think they would not, he is genuinely surprised that I'm here like more than, a year and a half later, I'm still here. But we had to, that's what I mean. Like if he was not willing to go through that, we wouldn't have gotten to a shared understanding, a shared reality. So I can't see how any of these diversity initiatives or anything can work if people like him. So if people like him at the leadership level, I mean, we should target the leaders, because that's really where it is. Like a lot of people target at the bottom, like let's bring people in, let's do this, let's do that. What we should target is the leaders. Like if the leaders change, then they have a lot of power to change other things, right? To provide cover, to provide protection, to change things, to provide to change the direction. If the leaders don't change, it does not matter what you're doing. Like, I mean, the grassroots movements can make the leaders change, but otherwise, if you have leadership that doesn't value certain ideas, that doesn't value what you bring to the table, who doesn't value like diversity, inclusion, and equity, I don't see how anything is going to change. If we don't have accountability, like if people are not held accountable for the things they do, I just don't understand how things can change. So I don't know how this accountability can come. Like honestly, like can the Congressional Black Caucus do something, or I don't know. Like because if there's no accountability, I have no idea how we can change things. In terms of industry and academia, oh man, I just feel. So that's just my situation right now. I felt like I had a lot more. So I was actually thinking about going to academia, and I thought like I'd have more autonomy there, right? Because I would, do my own thing. I wouldn't have to deal with this and that. But then people were telling me there's so much politics there. And, hiring a new faculty member, so many people have to agree. And like some of them have been there forever. And so convincing everybody that this one thing is important. And then, so whereas like right now, I think I have a little bit more of an easier time to make a small change in my own team, right? In my own little team. Perhaps in academia, you can do that with the students you recruit too, right? But if the PhD students, the pool of PhD students you admit to your school is already like, zero diversity, and then the pool of students you have to recruit as a professor is also like zero diversity, right? And then how do you convince the entire department that you need more diversity? I don't know. And one thing I would say is that I think people don't realize that a lot of times people talk about academia versus industry as if they're like completely separate things. But I see the same people moving around. Like, I mean, once I see professors going to industry, people in industry going back to academia, collaborations, like visiting researchers, this, that, people writing grants together. I feel like it's the same people, basically. It's the same people in both places. Like, it's people's, our friends, their colleagues. And so I think this perceived separation between academia and industry it's not that big, in my opinion. It's the same people with the same ideas kind of, going back and forth between the two things, right? The same group of people basically, in my opinion, run both industry and academia, It's the same colleagues, the same friends, and the same group of people are shut out of both opportunities. So I don't think we should think there is too much of a separation between industry and academia. But I just feel, for me, I think there's the same battles in both. Like, I honestly don't see that huge of a difference, except I guess in industry, I have a little bit of more power to hire someone if I can convince my manager, right? Like, and then who can convince his manager. Whereas in academia, I feel like I have to convince so many more people to recruit this one student or whatever. And so honestly, I see academia changing so slowly because they're so conservative, right? When I'm visiting schools, I remember I visited MIT, and students were telling me like they could not find advisors to like work on the kinds of things we're talking about, and like they started reading groups and stuff, but like people are not taking it seriously. Like, I just feel like academia moves so slowly on this, and I don't know when something is going to change in academia, right? So I don't know. That was sort of my thinking.
And Timnit, as we near the end of this interview, as you probably expected, you're on a podcast called the Radical AI Podcast. So we have to ask you 2 questions. The first one is, how do you define the word radical? What does that word mean to you? And do you situate yourself, your story, and your research in that definition? If you do, how?
That's interesting. How do I define the word radical? Something that's transformative, maybe. But a lot of times I feel like what we consider radical, it happened somewhere different, or it happened in a different community, or it happened in the past sometime, but we just didn't know about it or whatever. And so now we're thinking of it as radical, right? Like, I don't know how to explain it. Like, I think that like, a practice that we think is radical many times is not a new practice. It just happens that maybe we don't know the historical context under which this practice happened before and wasn't considered radical by certain groups of people. And so we're trying to bring it into, we're trying to practice it now. And so then people might think it's radical, right? Like people thought it was, like for example, just one simple example I want to give is, people think it's radical for me to have my hair the way it is. In the sense that literally for me to comb my hair and not do anything else, and for it to grow out of my head the way it is, and have an afro, because that's literally how my hair grows out of my head, people think some people say that's radical because I'm not straightening my hair. I'm not doing, because there's been politics around Black women's hair forever. Right? And like, so it's supposed to be unkempt. If it's not an afro, it's supposed to be like this. But just me wearing my hair as is, people, some people would consider it radical, or braiding it or whatever. But that's only the case because we've been in the past X number of years kind of brainwashed into thinking for some reason. For me, it's crazy that people think, that me having just my hair as is, like growing out of my head, is the thing that's radical, right? So that's what I mean. Sometimes it's, something that is, that we consider radical or transformative or different, or an idea that, is just so different or out of the ordinary, is something that's just so ordinary for some groups of people, or has been so ordinary for a very long time. So for me, honestly, like many times radical does not mean like so different or extraordinary. It just means bringing back like ideas that, things that are that are actually very ordinary, and for some reason we have been brainwashed to think that they're not. So maybe that's what I would say about that.
So as we close, normally we ask our guests if they have a piece of advice for students who are beginning their work, their PhD work, or working in this field. And I actually want to bring a twist to that question. So we started out this interview with you talking about how much you've changed and grown in the last, since 2012 in your journey. And thinking about where you might be, in 8 years or in 6 years. And I'm wondering if there's one piece of wisdom that you're sitting with right now that you want yourself to remember in 8 years.
I think one is to allow people to evolve. Sometimes some people say in the era of Twitter and stuff, we're too harsh. Someone says something 10 years ago, and we don't forgive, we don't forgive them. We don't, human beings have to be allowed to evolve, right? I get new information. I should change my ideas. Otherwise, I shouldn't be sometimes people say, someone flip-flops or something, but it depends, right? But if I have new information and I talk to new people, somehow I should update my belief about the world, right? So one example is that, for example, I remember in 2012, I thought drones were fine. I really thought I would argue with my friends and stuff. I'm like, so what else are you going to do and all that? And right now, I think drones are some of the worst things that have, happened, right? And I don't know what I'll think, 10 years later after talking to more people and more, reading more or whatever. And so we have to allow people to, or sometimes we say, oh, so-and-so, campaigned for this person, 50 years ago or something. We have to a certain extent, we have to allow people to evolve. Otherwise we can't go get anywhere. And I think I love, Sabelo just had this interview that I shared on Twitter about restorative justice and Ubuntu and different kind of ways of having justice, right? For example, how people approached it in the Rwandan genocide and apartheid versus, the Holocaust, for example. He was talking about that, right? So that's what I would say. We just have to allow people to evolve and have different ideas, and different interests and different beliefs about the world.
And for our listeners who want to find out more about you and your work and your research, is there a place that you would like to direct them?
Let's see. I haven't been keeping everything up to date, so we can go to blackinai.org for people who want to request to join as allies or as members of the Black and AI community. We can follow me on Twitter. I just write all sorts of stuff and share things I'm interested in. And the ethical AI team, Meg Mitchell is my co-lead for the ethical AI team. I'll also follow her on Twitter. I don't know if we're trying to have a public facing a website for our ethical AI team. And so we're going to work on that soon. And also, my friend Jelani Nelson runs a nonprofit called Coder that I'm involved in too. And so check that out, and support. People can also always donate to Black and AI and Coder and things like that. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, Timnit, thank you so much for joining us today and for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
We again want to thank Dr. Timnit Gebru for a wonderful conversation today. And again, especially as we're releasing this episode right now with so much going on in our world that is directly tied into everything that Timnit brought up, right? The anger, the fear, the unfairness, the issues of representation. I've been thinking a lot about this conversation actually in the past few weeks since we recorded it, and what my role is as a white person, specifically a white person who is co-hosting a podcast about radical issues, including, race and gender, and trying to, lift up folks, and what that means. Like, what does it really mean to be radical while still controlling the means of privilege and controlling the conversation? And Jess, you and I have talked about this a little bit. Like, there's a certain level of power, right, in us being able to figure out what questions to ask. And we're grateful to be doing this work because, it's better than the alternative, which might just be, to go back to the well of lifting up the status quo of the same, straight white men who are, on most panels right now. And so we like to think that we're a good alternative, but issues of representation play out, in media all the time. And to a certain degree, we are part of that media. So this is all to say that Timnit's reflections make me really sit back and ask some hard questions about, what are we doing here in this project?
Wow. Yeah, I think there's definitely an elephant in the room, and that elephant is privilege, especially for our podcast. Like you said, we're two well-meaning white folks who talk about a lot of things that we have never personally experienced, at least probably. I'm assuming that you've never experienced issues of racism and maybe even issues of sexism. And these are things that we unpack quite a bit in our conversations. And something that Timnit said that really stuck with me quite a bit was this idea of reality, and that we all live a different reality. Even if we are experiencing the same thing on the outside, our inside reality is quite a bit different. And it's especially different for people who are marginalized. And that's something that maybe I've experienced to a certain extent in some circles, but more commonly, I probably have not experienced, and most definitely haven't experienced at the levels that many people have in this country. And so this conversation is so fitting for right now, when people need to come together who have these different lived experiences and who are living in these different realities, to be there for each other and to empathize with each other, even though there's no way that we can know what each other has been through.
Yeah, and you know my podcast style. I'm all about appropriate vulnerability and like pulling back the curtain, right? Because I think it's important to model that, as anyone who's in public, right, is should model that appropriate vulnerability. And this has been one of the most we've had so many different takes of like our intro and outro of this particular episode, because there's no perfect thing to say, right? There's no perfect thing that we can say or that we can do. Like, we can try to do the work. We can try to be part of the people doing the work. We can try to be allies. We can try to be more than allies. We can lose track of what language to even use about allyship. And we can create a podcast in which we talk about these issues, but we don't have any solutions, although we so badly want to have solutions to these kind of things. And we were even talking as we were doing the intro, like I came up with the idea to do like a moment of silence, but then like it just feels like such bullshit to have a moment of silence while, like, last night I stood outside just as part of a crowd rioting, and it's like silence doesn't seem to be the answer. And at the same time, there needs to be so much time for mourning and for grief, and then also time for anger and for noise. And how do you make room for all of that? And how do you make room for all of that during an hour-long podcast? And the answer is
probably over an hour at this
probably
point.
Over an hour, and you can't do it. And so it's just like this perfect imperfection of trying your best to make sense of it all. And and to like name where you're coming from, and just trying to be intentional at the very least of what we're doing. And so I think that that's like kind of my hope for this episode, is that we decenter our voices a little bit and our experiences, and this can be a space and part of the overall movement out in the world right now to, at the very least, talk about some really difficult things to talk about and have some really difficult conversations about racism, about violence, about systematic oppression.
Yeah, and that was one of the main reasons why we made this podcast in the first place, was because we wanted to bring up those radical and difficult conversations that people are just too scared to talk about. And even Timnit brought up at one point in this interview that people tell her she has hashtag communication difficulties, but really she's just communicating difficult things that people aren't ready or don't want to hear. And maybe that's all we're doing right now. We're not necessarily offering solutions or we're not necessarily offering solutions or answers to problems that we don't know enough about, but we're bringing them up and hopefully starting a better dialogue between ourselves, people in industry, people in the academy, and honestly, everyone.
And to a certain degree, that's where change happens, is, through awareness, through education, and then through conversation. So, for listeners out there, thank you for being part of this journey with us. We want to state clearly that we stand with Black Lives Matter. We stand with Data for Black Lives. We stand with Black in AI and similar groups. And we are here both to create space and then also to listen. So I guess it feels weird to do a standard exit and outro for this episode, but we have to outro at some point. So for more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. And as always, stay radical.